All right, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sylvia Bubaltz, and I am the district supervisor for the Brookings Office of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. I want to thank you all for joining us today, as October is actually known as National Disability Employment Awareness Month, or NDEAM. And this year's theme for NDEAM is America's Recovery, Powered by Inclusion, which reflects the importance of ensuring that people with disabilities have full access to employment and community involvement during the national recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I introduce our presenter for today, I do want to give a thank you to our sponsors for today's event, the Department of Human Services, Services to the Blind and Visually Impaired, the Board of Vocational Rehabilitation, the Statewide Independent Living Council, Advance and Career Advantage, the Brookings Area Chamber of Commerce, the Brookings Disability Awareness Committee, and also the local NDEAM committee. We will have some time at the end of today's presentation to answer some questions that you have, but please feel free to enter them into the chat as I will be monitoring it throughout the presentation. So I'll go ahead and ask those questions to Marcy when we're ready for those. So today I do have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Marcy Ciampi, and her presentation, The Autistic Teacher, Lessons Learned. Marcy lives in the Pacific Northwest. She is a published author, global ambassador, doctoral student, and a senior manager at the engineering company Ultranauts, Inc. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marcy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you so much for being here today. We're currently in South Dakota and really enjoying our trip and the wonderful people we're meeting. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. My name is Marcelle Ciampi, and my author's name, actually more people know me by my author's name, is Samantha Kraft. The first question I have for you today, if you had to describe yourself or sum up your life in just a few sentences, in just a few minutes, what would you say? And how would you identify? And could you do that without labels? Would you perhaps focus on your ethnicity or race or the gender spectrum? Or perhaps you would consider your emotions and your feelings or your suffering and challenges or your faith in a higher power? Would you talk about your connection to the universe or animals on the planet, perhaps biodiversity or places you've traveled? Or maybe your favorite outfit, your favorite hat or favorite tie or favorite pair of boots? Or maybe you'd take some time to reflect upon your life and the places that you've been and the remarkable people that you've met that have taught you lessons in life and more about yourself, and some of the triumphs that you've had or challenges and barriers that you've faced, or your family, or your friends, or your old classmates, or your childhood. Maybe you would talk about your siblings that frustrate you, or your 3 beautiful sons that happen to all graduate on the same day in 2020 during a very difficult time for everyone on our planet. Or that one day that is forever etched in your memory that you cannot forget, that you decided to make into that year's Christmas card. I see someone smiling out there. Thank you. Brad gets it. Or that you're super fantastic at the virtual reality game on Oculus of Beat Saber and you're almost at an expert level. Or that when you were 4 years old, you adamantly refused to ever eat lamb again after you found out where it came from. And when you were in middle school, after dissecting fetal pigs, you refused to eat pork. And by the time you entered high school, you looked closely at your mother's meatloaf and swore never to eat meat again. Or maybe in a more serious note, you recall the times where people saw something on the outside that didn't really reflect who you were on the inside, and that there was so much more to you and so many more complexities than people ever saw or knew. Or that Marcy loves David and David loves Marcy, and Marcy and David both love books. These are some of the thoughts that came to my mind as I was planning my keynotes for this year. And I was contemplating, what could I share so that you see me for me and not some label? Today, I'll be presenting on 3 lessons I've learned in the last 11 or so years since I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in my early 40s. Be talking about the lessons learned of there's no such thing as a perfect brain, how important role models are, and what I've learned about the power of belonging. The first thing that I learned, and it took me most of my life, is there's no such thing as a perfect brain. In fact, I don't know how many of you know this, but after Einstein passed away, the doctor that was in charge of his care, his autopsy, actually stole his brain and put it in a jar and traveled the United States with Einstein's brain, Albert Einstein's brain, in a jar. And it's rumored that he, out of respect, when he would check into an inn, he would actually rent out a separate room in honor of Einstein's brain. And it's described as him taking quote unquote chunks from his brain and sending them to prestigious people all over the United States, universities and scientists and professors, because he wanted to figure out what made the brilliance of Einstein. As it turns out, no one could really figure out or agree upon why Einstein was uniquely the way he was. However, in recent years, leading experts in the field of autism have concluded that more than likely Einstein was on the autism spectrum. Well, I like to think of it this way, that there's really no such thing as a perfect brain in a jar. And if there was, we couldn't really figure out what was making it tick. And if there was a perfect brain in a jar, it might have been someone who was a little different than the typical norm, someone who was a neurodivergent or neurovariant, someone who diverged from the mainstream ideal of a normal mind and brain, or was a variation of a imaginary normal brain or mind. This is a watercolor painting that I did around 11 years ago. This was around the time that I was exploring my thoughts and emotions that I might be on the autism spectrum. For my whole life, I had searched for answers for why I was different. And I never felt like I was believed or seen or heard, which is very common for females on the autism spectrum, Asperger's, autistic, however someone chooses to identify. If you look at this picture, on one side is one person, on the other is another facing sideways. And in the middle, it forms a face that is screaming and crying in agony. For me, this picture, as they say, speaks 1,000 words. I spent a lifetime trying to be understood and trying to understand myself for more than 4 decades. And when I say trying, I went to psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, magnet therapists, hypnotists, reverends, you name it, neighbors, friends. And I didn't understand why I seemed to perceive and process and present in the world differently than most people I knew, than my friends and than my family members. For instance, I wasn't good at small talk and I seemed to have no filter, and I lost friends easily by saying things that were deemed inappropriate. And I was still am very, very empathetic and have deep, deep wells of emotions and intense thought processes and so forth. My autistic journey for myself began actually many, many years ago with my son, who's now 22, when he was diagnosed Asperger's in California at the age of 5. And at that time, I didn't recognize that I was on the autism spectrum, and wouldn't until 7 years later, which is often the case of females and people of populations that are historically underserved or underrepresented, such as people of color, people in the LGBTQIA community, plus community, and people from less fortunate circumstances economically and different demographics. And that's still the case today. Largely, we see white, young males, middle class, upper middle class being diagnosed, and a lot of us are overlooked or not believed. My journey took the next step when I was going to pursue a degree in mental health counseling. Tony Atwood is an expert in Asperger's, and he writes and speaks of the fact that a lot of females on the autism spectrum are drawn to service work, such as being teachers or counselors. And that was me to a T. I first became a school teacher and then had a strong inkling and desire to become a counselor. And while I was in the counseling program, I found out through a therapist that we had to see as part of the program requirements that more than likely I had Asperger's. In fact, she had been treating and seeing my son at the time, who was a young preteen or about teenager years. And I had noticed when I was meeting with her that I would talk on and on and on, almost nonstop, our whole sessions. And I began to think perhaps, like my son, I had Asperger's, is what we said at the time. And when I asked her, I said, do you think I might have Asperger's syndrome? Again, this was about 10, 11 years ago. She said, you most definitely. And that's when my self journey with the autism spectrum began. And I was in the program, so I went to the dean of the university, and I waited till after class because he was my professor. So he was the dean of the counseling program. And I thought, well, this is definitely someone that I want to disclose to and let him know that I am in this program. I'm one of your students, and my therapist strongly believes I have Asperger's syndrome. And she thought it would be important to let you know. And his response was entirely different than what I expected. I expected him perhaps to be inquisitive or to give me resources and information to be my educator. But instead, he spent about 5-10 minutes using the reason of the family system theory to tell me that I was more than likely making up my diagnoses so that I could be closer to my son, and asked me if I was proud I was announcing to the world that my brain and my son's brain were broken. And that is when my writing journey began and my processing journey began. And that's really what's led me to speaking and presenting around the world as I do. At that time, I didn't understand why anyone would see Asperger's or autism as something that was broken. I'd had a lot of struggles with my son. It was one of the hardest parts of my life. There were many challenges that he faced, and we faced as a family together, but I never would have considered him broken or myself broken. And so to process, I set out and I started to write, and I ended up writing online. I was going to be every day for a year, Everyday Asperger's, and I ended up writing 3 blogs and 500,000 words. And that, unknowingly at the time, would lead me to thousands of beautiful people all over the world, autistic people, Asperger's with autism, however they choose to identify, and their supporters. And because of that, I was able to reconnect with myself and find my community for the first time, and finally be seen and recognize my own beauty and reclaim the self-esteem that I had when I was that very precocious little girl and very determined little girl. And because of that, event at the university and the processing that I went through in writing and emotionally, the dark night of the soul, if you will, I created a checklist, which I used to call females with Asperger's checklist. Now it's out of respect to multiple types of people on the gender spectrum and out of respect to the changing diagnoses labels, it's now called the Autism checklist, and it's for everyone. And that has led thousands around the world, from Australia, South America, and so forth, to receive a diagnosis of being on the spectrum. So they are no longer alone, and they are no longer struggling to be seen and to be understood. That's a little bit about my background of what has brought me here today and why this is such an important topic for me. If I can spare anybody 4 decades of trying to figure out why they felt that they didn't belong on this planet, if just one person and I can spare them that grief and that suffering, then it's worth it to me. And it's also very important to me that we have open and frank discussions about how to support people that are different in their neurological presentation and their challenges and the unique gifts that they bring in, that we all bring to the workplace and other communities. This is taken and adapted from the diagnostic manual. For me, autism means a different way that I, as I mentioned before, perceive and process and present in the world. I choose not to see it through a deficit lens, through a medical model lens, but through a social disability lens. And I focus on my strengths. I acknowledge my challenges. I acknowledge that I need help every day in one way or another, and that life is never easy, but that every day is a gift. And when I think about my own autism, and I am only one person out of millions, so I do not represent every autistic person any more than you on this call represent every human being on this earth. When I think about my autism, I am reminded of my sensory sensitivities. And what most people don't know is it's not just the environmental sensitivities, such as sounds and lights and textures and clothing and smells. It's also internal. I am in touch and sense at a deep level my digestion, my heartbeat, my skin, just everything is intense. It's an intense world for me. And it's like that all the time. It also affects how I feel my body in space and my spatial awareness and what's around me. Autism also goes hand in hand with having difficulties with facial recognition. I have a hard time remembering what my neighbor looks like, even what my own children look like, and their faces seem to shift all the time, every time I'm talking to them. And with my boyfriend, who's also on the spectrum, he looks different to me every time that I focus on his face. Classically, autism, everybody on the autism spectrum has challenges that never go away. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. It's throughout our lives and it's heritable. It's from birth. And the social challenges that I have, communication challenges that I have, affect my pragmatic language. I have been studying social communication and psychology since I was a young girl because my mom worked for the renowned Virginia Satir, which is a therapist that was well known in the 70s and so forth. And I was fortunate to study and be attracted to that topic of social communication. So like some autistic people, I had become actually an expert in communication. I was a school teacher and I am a corporate consultant, but it's taken a lot of hard work and it's never easy. It's akin, I've heard before someone saying it's like learning to ride a bike every day, over and over again. For me, social communication is not like learning to ride a bike every day. It's like learning to surf. And I have surfed in Maui before. It's like learning to get on a surfboard and learning how to surf again every day. Things that come natural to people, like how fast to talk and how close to stand towards someone and when to stop talking and when to start talking. I interrupt all the time, and how much to share and how much not to share, and when do I consider you a friend and when are you not a friend, and what are boundaries, and how do I state those boundaries? Those are all foreign to me. It is literally as if I've been dropped down on a planet where everybody speaks and acts a different way in a different language. And I'm every day having to go through those social rules and remind myself in my mind. Just this morning, I had breakfast and I had to remind myself around 3-4 times when it was my time to speak, because I have difficulty with when to interject and when not to. I also used to lose friends all the time because I didn't understand small talk. And as I said, I have very small filter or lack of filter. And I would share about stories of ghosts and aliens and boys I'd kissed. And people would look at me peculiar or think I was too intense or strange. Now, fortunately, I know lots of weird, strange, dork people that love me and I love them. But then it was very confusing. I couldn't find a place to fit in. I also stim. I stim through verbalizing things in different ways or the same way over and over again, like asking the same question. And this calms and helps to regulate me. And I might stim by clicking my nails or tapping my feet or twirling my hair or rocking back and forth. And these all help to regulate my sensory overload, my emotional overload, my anxiety overload, and so forth. I think I've covered enough there. Also, the repeated patterns. So for me, the repeated patterns and interests have accumulated into thousands and thousands of hours of study into one topic, which is very common for people who are autistic or Asperger's. My topic of interest in the last 7 years has been autism and autistics in employment and creating communities of belonging. And so I've had over 3,000 hours of reading about the topic. And on average, I read or research or study or go on social media and connect with people about the topic about 4 or 5 hours a day for the last 7 years. And I've also had over 10,000 one-on-one correspondence with people who have similar neurology as I do. And all this has led to me being what I would consider an expert in the field of autism and the workplace. And it's a unique attribute that many of us on the spectrum have. One last note, it is a neurodevelopmental condition, but people like my friend Katie, they might be on the autism spectrum, but become experts in communication. In fact, Katie is a counselor who counsels couples, married couples and similar couples about how to communicate and how to get along. And my partner has a master's in divinity, and he counsels people all the time about how to live the best life and to take advantage of their strengths. So although we have challenges and we have strengths, and it's a lifelong condition, those challenges and strengths fluctuate and change throughout our lifetime. There's also non-speakers on the spectrum. That is the preferred terminology right now because they're not nonverbal. They just don't use their vocal cords in the same way as we do. And in no way does someone not using their vocal cords denote their intellect in any way. And autistic people come in all shapes and sizes from all over the world. I've spoken to everyone, a person on every continent, at probably every age, all different colors, all different genders. And it doesn't pick or choose. And what we're largely think of when we think of autism is white males under 30, middle class, who are sometimes still living with their parents. And that's a stereotype and that's a generalization. And it's often, we often see that on the media and on social media over and over again. And even some of these big businesses with autism hiring practices, that's who we see. But I'm here to say we're just like any other human being. We're all shapes and sizes and colors, and some of us have white hair and some of us are just being born today. And it's something that's been with us since as long as the earth has been here and human beings have been here. Also, if you are autistic, then more than likely you have several coexisting conditions. Research shows that there are at least 4 coexisting conditions that accompany being on the spectrum. And for me, I have at least 8. Some of those are dyslexia, ADHD and OCD traits, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD. I call myself a neurovariant because I vary from the mainstream ideal of a normal brain or mind, but I see myself as a beautiful variation today, such as the beautiful variations we see in butterflies or in birds like finches. Neurodiversity can be a complex term that some people don't understand. So very briefly, to give us that background, neurodiversity is an umbrella like diversity, and we all belong under the neurodiversity umbrella. We wouldn't say a person is a neurodiverse person or a neurodiversity person, just like we wouldn't say they're a diversity person. We might say that someone's under the neurodiversity umbrella, or if they're like me and they're neurodivergent or neurovariant and are an ADHD or dyslexic or Tourette's or PTSD or mood conditions or acquired brain injury, all those things that set us apart from that imaginary typical normalcy of a brain or mind, then we would say that they're neurodivergent or neurovariant. Neurodistinct is another word. Neurominority is sometimes used, but I steer away from that word because there are many people in the United States who have been historically oppressed and marginalized and part of underserved groups, people of color, or Black and brown friends and colleagues, or perhaps yourself. And they are advocating to move away from the use of the term minority. So I don't use the word neurominority, and it's a very individual choice. Anyone with a hidden disability who considers himself disabled or someone with a disability has a right, and it is part of their dignity to be able to decide how they self-identify. I identify as almost anything. I even say you can call me a turnip. I really don't care. But other people, they have preferences like autistic or Asperger's or with autism. Right now, most prefer, according to surveys, 81% prefer autistic over with autism. So that is the trend right now. And about 50% no longer like on the spectrum. So I will be changing my vocabulary as I look into that more and more. So it's a culture continually changing. Back to neurodiversity, it means all types of neurotypes, everybody accepting everyone on our planet. It's similar to biodiversity, where we are respecting and honoring all the different plants and living organisms on our earth and looking at their relationships to each other. Neurodiversity is recognizing that human variations in the way we think and process and learn are natural part of evolution and our genes, and they're not something that should be pathologized, I think that's how you say it, but something that is normal. And neurodiversity isn't about setting one type of brain apart as better or less than, and it leads to this cognitive diversity and moves us away from that groupthink. There are many positive spins that you'll see large organizations talking about autistic people. Here are some of the common ones that I share actually with my CEO of Ultranauts, my direct supervisor. We talk often about the intense focus and the natural way of thinking outside the box and the strong logic skills. This isn't just for autistic people. In my research, I have found so many overlaps between ADHD, gifted intellect, and dyslexic, to name a few, where I am finding more and more that neurodivergency in general, being a neurovariant specifically, brings in these unique ways of seeing and presenting in the world that contribute to the workplace, such as unorthodox way of solving problems and innovative thinking, and being able to anticipate upcoming needs and challenges, and brainstorming, and pattern seeking and seeing patterns that aren't there. Something that you won't often hear that I love when I find little golden nuggets in my research is there was a research study that talked about how autistic people actually come to a situation, conversation with less explicit bias. And they theorize it has to do with the way we take in the world and perceive and process and have a bottom-up type of thinking. And whereas instead of having a hypothesis and trying to prove it, we take in hundreds of different clues and patterns around the world or around our world, and we collect all of that and synthesize it and then come up with what our hypothesis is. So instead of this is what I think and I'm going to prove it, it's like, what do I think? Let me look around. Oh, this is what I think. Now I want to talk about it. So when we meet people and we go into a situation, we're not traditionally bringing in those lenses of What is your status? Where are you from? What is your degree? How much money do you make? I'm not speaking for every autistic person, but for the thousands and thousands I know, most of us will enter a situation and we don't care about those things. As I recently shared in a keynote earlier this morning, if someone from a big organization like the CEO of Fortune 500 company contacts me, which happens more than once, or if someone who is never graduated high school and from an oppressed community and really has nothing you would say offers me in a traditional networking way, I don't prioritize. I don't put that into hierarchies like who's more important and who should I contact first. I see people as human beings first, and I see their personhood. And so as we're entering those talks of diversity, equity, inclusion, it's good to keep in mind, it's effective, beneficial to keep in mind that autistic people can bring that new, fresh set of eyes, not only to situations and problem solving, but to relationships and to community building. When I say expert, I was really uncomfortable with that word. And a lot of autistic people are uncomfortable with the word expert. And they're also uncomfortable selling themselves and talking about why they are great or would be good at a job. And that's one of the reasons why it's hard sometimes for us to get a job. And we're also oftentimes, and this is according to lots of reports from supervisors and friends and family and autists themselves, I'm not pulling this out of a hat, or often we underemphasize and we overstress what we might be doing wrong. We typically are over honest and over transparent. So in a job interview, and I've interviewed as a recruiter, as a lead recruiter, I had the opportunity to interview hundreds and hundreds of autistic people. And one thing I noticed, one of the questions we had is, do you consider yourself a prompt person? And there was a number of times where candidates, job seekers, were so honest and so sincere and really sweet, frankly. And they would say, well, there was that one time when I was in college and I had that college professor and I did come 10 minutes late to that class. We take things literally and we want to tell you the truth. And so being an expert, that word was hard for me because I don't like to sell myself, and maybe I'm not an expert. Maybe there's a word I don't know or a fact I don't know. And I found these quotes about being an expert very comforting. And why I think a lot of autistic people and those with similar neurological profiles become experts is that they build this vast network in their brain of files, of those old card catalog files and cabinets where they can pull out and find information that they need. And I consider myself an expert, not because I think I'm better than someone else or know so much more than someone else, but that I know where to find the answers and that I have these amazing connections in my brain that a lot of ADHDers have, where I'm like a giant dendrite or a giant tree, and I can just go down these branches and find the information I need. And if I can't find it, I can invent it myself. In fact, I created the name neurovariant, and a lot of people in the autistic community and their supporters are appreciating the word. Those on the spectrum also have spiky profiles. It's a word you might hear. And that means while I am excellent in some areas, such as synthesizing information and learning and researching and studying and teaching, and also I'm very effective at maintaining and keeping friendships after lots of practice, there's other things that are very difficult for me, such as opening up mail. It might sit on my desk for a month. And part of that has to do with object permanence, where I don't always trust what's inside something or can't always believe it's there unless it's right in front of me. So even opening up my clothes to get dressed in the clothes drawer to get dressed in the morning can cause me anxiety because I'm not really knowing it. Are those clothes really there? Or are they where I left them? I read recently about a young man who was talking and writing about his spiky profile. He was on the spectrum or is on the spectrum. And he was saying how he has 2 college degrees, 2 master's degrees, I believe, but he still couldn't get himself to drive through the drive-through, that it was too hard to go through the fast food drive-through for him. And that's how it is for me. I find it very comforting when I can have one of my 3 sons or my partner or a friend by my side to do something that might seem really simple to someone, such as opening up a website and having to put in my password. That can cause me a lot of anxiety. But at the same time, I can create a spreadsheet with 3 years of goals and benchmarks and what we might do next to reach our company goals and so forth. So spiky profiles mean that we fluctuate in what we excel at and what we struggle with. It also might mean that throughout the day, I might have a lot of anxiety at 8 a.m. and then I don't have much at 10, but then again at noon, it goes up again, or my motivation levels, or my creativity levels, or my ability to want to communicate, that waxes and wanes throughout the day as well. And that's part of my spiky profile. So the first lesson that I learned was that there's no such thing as a perfect brain. The second lesson I learned is the importance of role models. Role models can come in all shapes and sizes, but particularly for a neurodivergent individual, it's important to have people that you can reach out to and can look up to and know that, I'm okay just the way I'm made. My role model is my aunt, who's 65 years old, and she was born with a rare congenital condition. She had severely clubbed feet. She had multiple operations. Her hand faced the opposite direction. She's endured painful procedures, multiple surgeries. By the age of 11, she had 9 surgeries. My aunt was also married and gave birth to a lovely child, has 2 beautiful grandchildren, and a life partner, Sarah, who she supported through a gender transition. She served as a founder of Mothers of Disability, as a disability advocate and support for women who are pregnant. She's also been a freelance writer and supports local musicians. She overcame many barriers. By 17, she'd been in 13 different schools and been bullied in every single school. They'd even make fun of the way she held her pencil. And finding work was very difficult. She would later become an award-winning real estate agent, but 2 agents at the start of her career told her she would never make it because of her profound disability, and she had a hard time finding work and earning a fair wage. Doctors said she'd never walk, and by the age of 3, with metal braces and platform shoes, or high-top shoes, she learned to walk. And in recent years, she's realized she's more than likely autistic. Most remarkable, doctors told my aunt, or actually told my aunt's mother, my grandmother, after they kept Kathleen away from my grandmother for 24 hours. And this is the quote of my aunt's words: "Your daughter will not be independent. She will be a heavy burden to you the rest of your life. Don't feed her and let nature take its course." Kathleen says that she believes the doctors were wrong, and she plans to continue and dance to the music of life. And the reason that I share her story is she's not a superhero. She's an ordinary human being, but she has an extraordinary life. And she is a mother and a partner. And she tells me and teaches me that society's messages of broken and wrong are lies. That was the second lesson I learned, the importance of role model. The last lesson that I've learned, or one of the lessons I've learned, is the importance of belonging. And for many of us, it's easier to think about what it means not to belong than it is to belong. And most, if not all of us, have those experiences of not belonging, and they really do etch a place in our soul. Social psychologist and author of Whistling Vivaldi, looking at my partner here because my dyslexia, it's hard to pronounce, Vivaldi. He speaks about stereotypes and how they affect us. And 20 years of research indicate that there's not one group in our society that doesn't have some type of negative stereotype. So belonging is an important issue for everybody, not just people who are neurodivergent or neurovariant or autistic or so forth. And again, it's so important to have those positive role models and to learn unique ways to approach those barriers and obstacles. Sadly, I'm in a doctorate program right now, and one of the textbooks we were reading more than once had some stereotypes that we still carry about communicating that have to do with eye contact and our body language. In fact, an expert consultant for CNN and an author stated, sadly, the most insidious, I want you to think about that word, the most insidious way we invalidate people is by denying them eye contact or using our body language to turn away. This is still being taught in our textbooks in colleges. We're still being taught that not making eye contact or moving a certain way is not okay, and that you're in fact insidious in your behavior. I, for one, do not like making eye contact. It makes me very uncomfortable, and I move my way in ways that aren't typical often, as do a lot of autistic people. There are places in India that are not in the urban centers that my friend taught me about, who's a social worker there, where you don't make eye contact. It's disrespectful. And there are many indigenous nations where it's disrespectful to make eye contact to your elders. So this is very much a cultural construct, and a lot of the discrimination and generalizations and ableism and stigmatism and bias, whatever you want to label it, that happens to autistic people has to do with these Western society structures, these neurotypical, you're a neurotypical if you have a typical brain or mind, so you're not neurodivergent. So these neurotypical standards, the way our society has rules that dictate how we move and how we use our vocal cords and how we dress and what work hours we should work and where we should work. And a lot of autistic people don't fit into that norm and don't fit into that mold. So one of the things we can do as supporters, or perhaps you're autistic yourself, is to start having discussions about why do we have these norms and why are they that important? I read on a Fortune 500 website, because I do research and in that area as well and helping them, that they had interview tips. And one of the interview tips was to make sure you take your sunglasses off. And I'm just like, why are we living in a society where we're basing whether we hire someone on whether they take their sunglasses on or off, and how they answer a question and how well they can mask or pretend to get through an interview, and how well they can sell themselves. Those are just some of the things that come to my mind on this topic. It's interesting to note in my research, the Center for Talent and Innovation, in looking at the workforce, found that 30% of the population, and they surveyed white-collared, college-educated workers and thousands, that 30% identifies with having at least one disability in the workplace. So when we are considering hidden disabilities, which are usually a part of a disability, if not the disability themselves, such as depression and anxiety that come with having a visual disability, we're talking about a large portion of the population. So when we sit down to discuss what helps autistic people, we are also developing ways to help the general population in the workplace. Of those 30% of people that identified with having a disability in the workplace, guess how many said they felt comfortable disclosing in the workplace? And there's a big push to disclose, when in fact, only 3.2% felt comfortable disclosing a disability because they didn't feel safe. They feared being stigmatized, being stereotyped and generalized. So we have a long way to go. And expecting people to disclose personal information about a hidden disability is really not smart in my book. It should be something that is up to each individual. So instead of asking people or forcing people to disclose about a hidden disability, creating workplaces that help everyone is the answer. And that's what I call universal design inclusivity. And I'm not the person who coined that term. It's based on architecture being inclusive for people with physical disabilities. At Ultranauts, we call it the universal workplace, and we look for ways that we can help the whole workforce community and don't segregate and look at one community such as autistics. And the reason most people cited they didn't want to disclose was because of a hidden disability. And over 34% in that survey had said that they had received some type of discrimination after they disclosed. And according to research, autistics oftentimes more than not regret disclosing in the workplace, myself included. There were assumptions made that I should have to attend emotional IQ training because I was autistic while my non-autistic colleagues didn't have to. There were assumptions that autistic people couldn't make good managers because we don't know how to navigate workplace politics. And this is false. It's like any other human being. Some of us would make great managers, some of us wouldn't. Some of us have great emotional IQ and understanding, and some of us do not. At Ultranaut, some of the things we're doing that go towards universal design inclusivity or the universal workplace are we create unspoken and spoken rules, manuals that help to guide not only the new employee and the job seeker through the workplace, but through everyone. So we have rules about how to speak in Slack and what's okay to say, and how long should an email be, and where can I go for answers, and who should I contact? We also have implemented ways to understand our team members. So we have what's called a biodex, and we list out things that we do well in and things that we have challenges in. So each employee, each manager, each coworker can go to someone's biodex and see what are their strengths, what are the things that we can support them in. And also, how do you like to have feedback? Do you like it that same day? Would you like it at the end of the week? So all of these ideas of making an employee a person and not a number, not a diversity, but that actual inclusion part. We also regularly collect and monitor feedback. We have daily polls, we have weekly polls, we have weekly surveys, and we even have a company outside of our firm that analyzes the psychological safety of our employees. These are all ways to incorporate universal design. We have follow-up calls after people have been hired 60 days or 3 months with specific questions, and people can either answer them in writing anonymously, or they can have a one-on-one call. Questions such as, do you understand your job? Is there anything we can do to support you? Do you understand your manager's job? Do you understand the mission of the company? Do you feel supported? Do you feel like you belong? We also acknowledge our employees by having channels like kudos channels where we give people virtual high fives. And we've recently started to plan for the Diversity with Dignity Global Summit, which is going to be a global event where autistic people are put in positions of power, paid power, and people with authority. They have real power, and they're planning the summit to educate people more about neurodiversity and being a neurodivergent and universal design in the workplace. We have a recruitment overview as well for people first apply. We send them a handbook or a manual that goes through what to expect. It's 11 pages long of what to expect in our recruitment process, what the questions might be, who you might meet, and where to find resources such as best practices for going through an interview and so forth, which doesn't say take off your sunglasses. And I'll end with a story, which is part of our culture at Ultranauts. The most important thing for me to create communities of belonging is to be authentic and transparent and to be vulnerable. And one of our executives or managers, I'm not even going to put a label on it, someone at our company took that step. And during our company-wide meeting, this was not planned. For 20 minutes, they shared about their journey with depression and what a struggle it had been. And the chat room just lit up with, I'm so glad to work here. Thank you. And this is the most amazing thing. And for me personally, even though I've researched on this topic and I talk about this topic, it was one of the first times I felt I truly belonged there, because someone in an authority position was opening up about their vulnerability and their struggles. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do to create a community of belonging, is to come together as human beings and to talk about the things that we are challenged with, especially in this day and age when before COVID, 40% of people in the USA identified with feeling lonely. And after or during COVID-19, this global health crisis, I wonder how much larger that has become. So when we're approaching not only neurodiversity, but our global health crises and social justice crises and political crises, the most important thing we can do is start establishing what it looks like to truly belong in creating those places. Thank you for your time. I'm going to end on this page here. Whoops. And open up to questions.
Thank you, Marcy. I appreciate everything that you've said so far today. It's been wonderful to have you. As we're opening things up for questions, I will be putting a link to our survey on the chat. So if you guys could all please fill that out. We enjoy having your feedback. I'm sure Marcy would also love to have your feedback as well. And if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat, or you can certainly unmute yourself.
Thank you, Katie. And as I always like to share when I'm teaching about best inclusive practices in the workplace, especially the remote workplace, if you're more comfortable writing in chat than speaking aloud, please do that. And I welcome you. I don't know if you have access to speak aloud, but if you do, you're welcome to speak aloud. And if you're more comfortable not asking in a group, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will put my full name here and you can reach out to me there. And I'm also going to put in some helpful links. Differentbrains.org is a wonderful organization. I know the founder. It's a not-for-profit, has lots of different podcasts and articles on people with different brains. And also neuroclastic.com has over 400 contributors and writers who are on the autism spectrum. I also recommend The Art of Autism, which I'm on the board of, and my partner's site is neuroguides.org. Those are just a few things, and I always forget to share my site. I'll put that last. And my site is a rabbit hole of information, which is there.
Marcy, we did get one question so far. It was asked, how does one get diagnosed later in life?
It's a fantastic question. And actually that last link that I put on there, myspectrumsuite.com, if you go under autism, because I get asked that a lot, way before I started giving presentations, just from people over the world trying to get a diagnosis. If you look under autism, I think I might be on the autism spectrum. Now what? And it goes a little bit through my journey and then has links. But long story short, in the United States, usually it's going to be a medical licensed psychologist or psychiatrist that needs to give you that official diagnosis. I believe also a neurologist might be able to do that. If you go to someone, don't be surprised if they don't know completely what autism is and how it presents in different ways. So I would recommend getting out different books, different websites, even printing out my traits list. It's on my website there, the Autism's traits list. And as is the case in many situations that involve the medical area, you have to be an advocate for yourself or an advocate for your child or loved one. And sometimes it takes going to more than one person. And sometimes it takes saying, no, I don't think you're correct. And these are the reasons why. It is a traits list. It's a checkoff list diagnosis. There's no test. There's no brain imaging that you can do. In fact, there's over 500 or 400 gene markers that they're finding with autism. There's not one gene that specifically can say this person's autistic or not. And there's so many overlaps with mood conditions and ADHD and what have you. So it's very much largely an interview of you, of perhaps your family members, and then different professionals use different types of checklists. They refer to the diagnostic manual and so forth. Any other questions? My son, who I mentioned, who got diagnosed when he's 5, he's now 22, and he graduated college 2 years early, and he lives with 3 wonderful roommates that are his friends. He's doing very, very well.
Marcy, I do have a quick question.
Sure.
As a supervisor, it was interesting to me when you talked about the things that your company has incorporated, but I was curious what kinds of conversations and how do you converse with your supervisor whenever you have needs that are that you're trying to express, or what is the best way for that conversation to happen based on your particular needs, and what have you learned in that process?
That's a great question. So I believe autistic people, like all human beings, have all different ways that they feel comfortable communicating. Some people prefer email, some people prefer Slack, some want face-to-face, in person, someone on a video, someone on a phone call. So most important thing is identifying for yourself or for those that you supervise, what's the most comfortable way that they feel they would like to communicate, especially if it's something sensitive or might have a lot of emotion attached to it, or a lot of autistic people have PTSD, almost a given. So taking that into consideration. So having those options available and allowing people to have choice. A lot of things that we practice are things that I practiced when I was a school teacher, is giving people options and choices and putting it out there so they're aware, here's all these different avenues. Some of us are more comfortable than others attaching our name to a concern or a complaint, and others aren't. So having multiple ways almost daily to be able to submit feedback of how we can improve. We have community gatherings once a month at Alternauts where we get together and get to know each other because we're a 100% remote company. And we talk about what's working, what's not working in the workplace. How can we improve it? It's part of our culture. It's there all the time. We have every other month, my partner hosts team forums where we get together, talk about the struggles of the world, the global crisis, the social justice crisis, the political crisis, and how we can support one another. What I like to call is core inclusion. I picture an avocado shooting out rainbows, and the pit at the avocado is inclusion. And at the core of every company is inclusion. It's not an afterthought. It's not a one and done. It's not a shot. It's not a quick fix. Every conversation, everything we approach is about, do you feel you're being heard? Do you feel like you belong? Our CEOs, my CEO and our supervisors aren't afraid to say, I made a mistake, or I don't think I did this right. And that comes down to humility. So creating the choice and then an atmosphere where it's safe to share that information, and then having it be there all the time, that this is a place where you can give feedback and there's not going to be consequences to your career or to your career growth or to your job and losing your job, and that we appreciate your feedback. And then part of that would be talking about ways to, and this will go back to the unspoken rules. How do we deliver feedback? We actually have handouts on how do you deliver feedback? What's the best way to deliver feedback? And then we have a second handout on what if someone doesn't take that feedback well, what are strategies you can use? And we have handouts on PTSD, and I teach classes or have taught classes on how to manage stress and anxiety in the workplace. So it's in like everything. I hope that makes sense. It's in everything that we're doing. So it's not so much how do we approach this one thing, it's where do I go to get this, and these here, let me point and show you where it's at.
Wonderful, thank you. And we do have one last question, and just where we're at with time. What advice would you give to businesses and representatives when interviewing or hiring individuals with an autism spectrum disorder?
So I actually wrote a manuscript of over 100,000 words, and this is probably 2 chapters. So it's really hard to say in the next few minutes, but if you go to Everyday Asperger's blog and you search for interviews, I do start off a discussion there about how autistic people often present in interviews. So knowing about the autistic experience and how they present is very, very important. And then I actually teach classes and consult on this topic. One of the number one things is to make it as objective as possible. There's always going to be some subjectivity, but having a rubric, and that rubric, such as 1 through 5, is based on how well did they answer the question, not based on how well did you like them, or you know, how did they sound, or how did they present with their verbally or with their bodies. Also, we invite them at the beginning to disclose if they'd like to, and that there's no obligation, but that we are very open to learning about hidden disabilities in our workplace, and that wouldn't be written down anywhere in their file. And then if the interviewer feels comfortable disclosing something about themselves, such perhaps their child's on the autism spectrum or they're neurodivergent in some way, we do that to create that transparency and get rid of that it's bad, that it's taboo in some way. And so we say that right up front. And we let them know that there's ample opportunity to ask questions if they need us to repeat a question, if they'd like to interject. And we also guide them along the interview. And I say them, I mean everyone, not just autistic, everyone who walks through the door. We guide them through the interviews. So if they answered something really short, or they're hesitating, they didn't give a lot of response, or they just don't know what to say, we offer, would you like to come back to that at the end of the interview, and we can revisit that. And then at the end of the interview, we also say, if there's anything that you didn't feel like you were able to share with us or touch base on, or if you even having anxiety about this experience, or you have questions, please email us. And we do sometimes have job candidates take advantage of that and say, I'm sorry, I slipped up on this part and I really want to add this to it. So again, just offering as many types of supports and choices and opportunities as possible, and treating people with that respect and holding a place for their dignity and for their self-worth. So, and they have the best chance possible. We're not choosing someone we want to be our best friend and go to the pub with. We're choosing someone who we see has potential and can do the job and can get the job done.
Wonderful. All right, well, that will do it for us today. Marcy, I really want to thank you again for being a part of our NDEAM event for this year. For everyone who joined, thank you for being a part of it, and we hope to see you back next year for our event. Thank you so much.
Feel free to reach out. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.